Here is something most English learners never realize. The moment you start speaking English, you are doing a completely different kind of work than when you are reading, listening, or watching videos. Reading gives you time. Listening gives you clues. Speaking asks for an answer right now. And that changes everything. Think about a simple situation. Someone looks at you and asks, "So, how was your weekend?" It is not a difficult question. You probably know the words. You understand the grammar. You may have heard similar answers hundreds of times before. Yet for a second or two, your mind goes completely quiet. Not because your English suddenly disappeared, not because you forgot the answer. What disappears is your ability to access the answer quickly. While the other person is waiting, you are trying to find the right words, arrange them into a sentence, make sure the grammar sounds right, and say everything clearly enough to be understood, all within a few seconds. Then another thought sneaks in. What if I say it wrong? The moment that thought appears, your attention gets divided. Part of you is trying to communicate. The other part is checking, judging, and second-guessing every word before it leaves your mouth. And that is usually where the freezing starts. A good comparison is learning to drive. An experienced driver does not think about every movement. Most of the process runs automatically. A beginner is different. They are watching the mirrors, checking the speed, thinking about the pedals, looking at the road, and trying not to make a mistake at the same time. The problem is not a lack of knowledge. It is too many things competing for attention at once. Speaking English often works the same way. That is why some people with a relatively small vocabulary can sound surprisingly fluent, while others who know thousands of words still struggle to speak smoothly. The difference is not how much English they know. The difference is how quickly they can pull that English out when the moment calls for it. And that gap between knowing something and being able to use it instantly is where most speaking struggles really begin. This is where things start to get really interesting. Most people assume speaking feels difficult because they do not know enough English. That seems logical. If speaking is hard, the obvious conclusion is that more vocabulary or more grammar must be the answer. But that is often not what is happening. The real issue is that too many things are competing for your attention at the same time. Think about how you speak in your native language. You do not build every sentence piece by piece. You do not stop to check verb tenses. You do not mentally review grammar rules before opening your mouth. The idea appears and the words follow. The process feels almost effortless. Now compare that with what many learners do in English. Before a single sentence comes out, a silent checklist appears. First, the vocabulary, then the grammar, then the pronunciation, then a quick review to make sure everything sounds natural. And sometimes one last check just to avoid making a mistake. All of that happens in a matter of seconds. It is a bit like driving a car while constantly looking under the hood to see if everything is working properly. The car is capable of moving. You just keep interrupting the journey. Take a simple sentence like, "I missed the bus." A fluent speaker says it and moves on. A learner might pause and think, should it be miss or missed? Do I need the? Am I saying it correctly? Is there a better way to express this? While those questions are running through your mind, the conversation keeps moving forward. And that is why hesitation is not always a sign that your English is weak. More often, it is a sign that your attention is overloaded. The more things you try to manage at once, the harder it becomes to say even the simplest sentence. And that creates a surprising problem. Sometimes the desire to speak perfectly becomes the very thing that stops you from speaking naturally. Most learners react to speaking problems in exactly the same way. They decide they need more vocabulary, so they save another list of words, memorize more expressions, and spend hours collecting language they hope will make speaking easier. At first, that seems like the obvious solution. After all, if speaking feels difficult, it is natural to assume the problem is a lack of words. But real conversations often tell a different story. You have probably met people whose English is fairly simple, yet they can talk comfortably for minutes at a time. They do not use impressive vocabulary. They do not sound like walking dictionaries. They simply use the words they know without hesitation. Now compare that with many advanced learners. Some of them know thousands of words. They understand movies, articles, and podcasts with little difficulty. Yet when it is time to speak, they get stuck, searching for the perfect expression. A simple sentence would do the job, but their mind keeps looking for something better, something more precise, something more natural, something more impressive. That search might only take a second or two, but in a real conversation, a second can feel much longer than it sounds. While you are searching, the the other person is waiting, the pressure begins to build, and suddenly, an idea that felt simple in your head becomes difficult to express. That is why speaking is not really a vocabulary contest. The goal is not to know the most words. The goal is to use the words you already know when you need them. Fluent speakers understand this instinctively. They do not spend most of their energy hunting for the best word. They use the first useful word that comes to mind and keep the conversation moving. And that reveals a distinction that changes everything. Knowing a word and being able to use it instantly are not the same skill at all. This is where many learners discover a gap they never even knew existed. For a long time, everything seems fine. You watch YouTube videos, you read articles, you listen to podcasts, and most of the time, you understand what is happening. A word appears and your mind instantly says, "I know that word." The sentence makes sense. The conversation is easy to follow. You feel like your English is improving, and it is. But there is a hidden catch. Understanding a word when you see it is one skill. Finding that same word when you need it is another. And the second skill is much harder. When you are speaking, nobody gives you clues. There are no subtitles, no vocabulary list, no highlighted word waiting to be recognized. You have to pull the word out yourself, often within a second or two. A simple example makes this clear. Think about someone you have met many times. The moment you see their face, you recognize them immediately. There is no effort involved. But if somebody suddenly asks, "What is their name?" you might pause. Not because you do not know it, because you cannot find it quickly enough. That feeling is surprisingly similar to what happens during many English conversations. The words are not missing, they are just harder to reach under pressure. And that difference matters more than most learners realize. Because recognition can create a false sense of confidence. You understand videos, you recognize hundreds of expressions, you follow conversations without much trouble. Naturally, you assume speaking should feel just as easy. Then a real conversation begins, and those familiar words suddenly feel much farther away. That is the moment many learners become frustrated, not because they forgot the language, but because speaking exposes a completely different skill. The real question was never, "Do I know this word?" The real question is, "Can I find it quickly enough while the conversation is still moving?" There is another reason people freeze that has nothing to do with vocabulary, grammar, or intelligence. It is perfection, and it quietly sabotages more conversations than most learners realize. Before many learners say a single word, they run a mental inspection. Is the grammar correct? Does the pronunciation sound right? Would a native speaker say it this way? Can I make this sentence better? At first, those questions seem useful. They feel responsible. They feel smart. But during a real conversation, they often create the very problem they are trying to prevent. While you are reviewing the sentence, the conversation keeps moving. The other person is still listening, still waiting. And conversations rarely pause long enough for a perfect answer. They reward clarity far more than perfection. Think about how people text their friends. Most messages are not carefully edited. People send them, realize they could have written them better, and continue anyway. The conversation matters more than the wording. Speaking works much the same way. In everyday conversations, even native speakers forget words, restart sentences, change direction halfway through a thought, and correct themselves without making a big deal out of it. They keep talking. The conversation keeps flowing. Many learners do the opposite. They try to build the perfect sentence before they allow themselves to say the first word. It is like trying to complete an entire puzzle before placing a single piece on the table. The longer you wait, the more pressure you create. The more pressure you create, the harder speaking becomes. Then the hesitation arrives. Then the silence. The irony is that fluency often starts improving the moment you stop demanding perfection from yourself. Because fluent speakers are not fast because they speak perfectly. They are fast because they keep speaking even when the sentence is not perfect. And when your attention shifts away from avoiding mistakes and toward sharing ideas, conversations start feeling much lighter, much easier, and far more natural. Have you ever noticed how differently you speak when nobody is around? You can practice alone and everything seems fine. You answer questions, describe your day, talk about your plans. Sometimes you even surprise yourself with how much English you actually know. Then another person joins the conversation, and suddenly, words that felt easy a minute ago seem much harder to find. Most learners see this and immediately reach a painful conclusion. My English is not good enough. But that is usually not the real issue. Your English has not changed. Your vocabulary has not disappeared. What changes is where your attention goes. The moment another person starts listening, a second conversation begins inside your head. How do I sound? Did I pronounce that correctly? What if I make a mistake? What if they do not understand me? What if this sounds strange? Without realizing it, you stop focusing entirely on the message and start focusing on yourself. Now you are doing two jobs at once. You are trying to communicate while also judging your own performance in real time. That split attention comes at a cost. Imagine carrying several heavy grocery bags while trying to solve a difficult math problem. You might manage both, but neither task will get your full attention. Everything becomes slower. Everything feels harder. The same thing happens during anxious conversations. Part of your mind is searching for words. Another part is busy preparing for problems that have not even happened yet. And the more attention those worries consume, the harder it becomes to find the language you already know. The words are still there. They have not disappeared. They are simply competing with everything else happening in your head. That is why anxiety does not just make speaking feel uncomfortable. It makes speaking less efficient. And once finding words becomes slower, hesitation naturally follows. Which raises an interesting question. If pressure affects everyone, why do fluent speakers seem much less affected by it? Here is something that surprises a lot of learners. Fluent speakers often sound as if they are creating every sentence from scratch in real time. But that is not usually what is happening. In many cases, they are leaning on familiar language patterns they have used so many times that they no longer need to think about them. Take phrases like, "To be honest, the thing is," "What I mean is," "At the end of the day." These are not just expressions people happen to like. They are shortcuts. The moment a speaker begins with one of these phrases, part of the sentence is already in place. Instead of building everything from zero, they are stepping onto a path they already know. That is one reason fluent speech sounds so effortless, not because every word is being carefully created in the moment, but because much of the structure has already been practiced. And the interesting part is that we all do this. Think about ordering coffee. You probably do not invent a new sentence every time you walk into a cafe. You rely on familiar patterns. "Can I get a coffee, please?" "I would like a latte. Could I have a medium one?" The details change, but the structure stays largely the same. That familiarity saves effort. Speaking English works in a very similar way. Many learners spend most of their time collecting individual words. Fluent speakers often focus on groups of words that naturally belong together. And that makes a bigger difference than people realize. Your mind can grab one familiar phrase much faster than it can assemble 5 separate words from scratch. The more useful patterns you have used and repeated, the less work you have to do during a conversation. The result is not just faster speech. It is less pressure, fewer pauses, more confidence. And eventually, speaking stops feeling like a puzzle you need to solve and starts feeling like a conversation you are simply taking part in. There is another hidden habit that slows many learners down, and most of them do not even realize they are doing it. It happens so quickly that it feels completely natural. Someone asks a question in English. Before answering, your mind takes a short detour. First, you form the response in your native language. Then you translate it into English. Then you quickly check whether the translation sounds right. Only then do you speak. The entire process might take just a few seconds, but in a conversation, a few seconds can feel like a long time. Because while you are translating, the conversation is still moving forward. The other person is waiting. The silence becomes noticeable, and the pressure starts to build. A good way to picture this is to imagine driving somewhere unfamiliar while stopping to check 3 different maps before every turn. You will probably get where you need to go, but the journey will feel slow, awkward, and full of unnecessary delays. That is often what constant translation does to speaking. It places extra steps between the thought and the words, and every extra step creates another chance to hesitate. Now, this does not mean fluent speakers never translate. Most language learners do it occasionally, even at advanced levels. The difference is that they do not depend on translation for every sentence. Over time, common situations become directly connected to English. Someone asks a familiar question, and an English response appears. A situation reminds them of a phrase they have used many times before. The extra conversion process starts disappearing. And that is when speaking begins to feel faster. Not because English suddenly becomes easier, but because there is less distance between the idea in your mind and the words coming out of your mouth. And once that distance gets smaller, your attention is finally free to focus on the conversation itself instead of constantly translating it in the background. There is a reason many learners feel confident while practicing, but struggle the moment a real conversation begins. The two situations may look similar on the surface, but they operate at completely different speeds. Most English learning happens at what we could call study speed. You read a question, you think for a while, maybe you review the grammar, maybe you search for a better word. Then, 10 or 20 seconds later, you give your answer. There is no pressure, nobody is waiting, nothing feels rushed. Real conversations work differently. They move at life speed. Someone asks a question, and the conversation naturally expects an answer within a few moments. Not because people are impatient, because that is simply how conversations work. The rhythm is faster, the gaps are shorter, the decisions have to happen in real time. And that is where many learners run into a problem they never experienced during practice. At a dinner table, during a meeting, or while chatting with a friend, there is no time to carefully assemble every sentence piece by piece. You have to respond while the conversation is still moving. That is why someone can perform brilliantly in a lesson and still freeze during a casual conversation. The knowledge did not disappear. The environment changed. What worked perfectly at study speed is suddenly being tested at conversation speed. A useful comparison is learning a musical instrument. You can spend hours learning notes, scales, and music theory, but understanding music is not the same as performing it in front of people. Performance requires speed, timing, and instant recall. Speaking English is no different. The challenge is not simply knowing the language. The challenge is finding the language quickly enough to keep up with the moment. And that leads to an important realization. Fluency is not built only by learning more. It is built by making what you already know easier, faster, and more automatic to use when the conversation begins. One of the biggest misconceptions about fluency is that fluent speakers always use advanced English. They do not. In fact, many of them regularly choose simpler language than learners expect. Their goal is not to sound impressive. Their goal is to keep the conversation moving. And that difference matters. Many learners believe they need the perfect word before they can continue speaking. So when that word refuses to appear, everything stops. The conversation pauses, the pressure grows, and a simple idea suddenly feels difficult to express. Fluent speakers usually respond very differently. If the exact word does not come to mind, they do not panic. They find another route. For example, imagine you suddenly forget the word microwave. Many learners would stop speaking and search for the missing word. A fluent speaker might simply say, you know, the machine that heats food. Is that the perfect definition? Not at all. But it does the one thing that matters most. It communicates the idea. And once the idea reaches the listener, the conversation continues. That ability to adapt is one of the most underrated parts of fluency. Because real conversations are not vocabulary competitions. Nobody is keeping score. Nobody is handing out rewards for finding the most precise word every time you speak. People simply want to understand what you mean. And sometimes, the fastest path to understanding is not the most sophisticated sentence. It is the simplest one. That is why people who use basic language confidently often sound more fluent than people with larger vocabularies. They keep moving. They keep communicating. They do not treat every forgotten word like a crisis. And once you develop that same flexibility, something interesting happens. The fear of getting stuck starts to lose its power. Because you realize that fluency is not about always finding the perfect word, it is about always finding a way to express the idea. At this point, an important question starts to appear. If speaking depends so heavily on retrieval, then why do so many learners spend most of their time doing activities that never actually train it? Think about a typical study session: watching videos, reading articles, reviewing vocabulary lists, listening to podcasts. There is nothing wrong with any of these activities. They are useful. They expose you to new words, new expressions, and new ways of using the language. But there is a catch. Most of them train you to recognize English, not produce it. And as we have already seen, recognizing language and retrieving language are very different skills. That is why someone can spend hours consuming English content every day and still struggle when asked a simple question. The issue is not always a lack of exposure. Sometimes the missing piece is practice pulling language out of memory. Try a simple experiment. Look around your room and describe everything you can see in English. Explain your morning routine without preparing. Retell the plot of a movie you watched last week. Suddenly, there is no safety net, no subtitles, no answer choices, no helpful clues pointing you in the right direction. Now your mind has to do the work itself, and that is exactly where growth starts happening. A good comparison is remembering names. You can read a list of names and recognize them later. But recognition does not guarantee recall. The names only become easy to remember after you have used them enough times in real situations. Language works the same way. The more often you force yourself to retrieve English, the easier that process becomes. The pathways get stronger. The response becomes faster, and eventually, something changes. The words stop feeling hidden somewhere in the background. They start showing up exactly when you need them. Here is something most learners never notice. They spend so much time watching what fluent speakers do well that they completely miss what fluent speakers do badly. And that creates a false picture of fluency. Because the truth is, fluent speakers get stuck all the time. They forget words, lose their train of thought, start a sentence, and suddenly realize it is heading in the wrong direction. Sometimes they stop halfway through and start again. None of that is unusual. The difference is not that fluent speakers never struggle. The difference is what they do next. Many learners treat a moment of hesitation like a warning sign. A word disappears, panic shows up, and all their attention shifts to the problem. The conversation slows down, confidence drops, and before long, they are thinking more about the mistake than the message they wanted to communicate. Fluent speakers tend to handle these moments differently. When a word does not come to mind, they do not freeze. They create space. They buy themselves a few extra seconds. You will often hear phrases like, "How do I say this? What is the word? Let me explain it another way. Actually, what I mean is..." These phrases may sound small, but they do something important. They keep the conversation alive while the speaker continues searching for the missing word. Think of a driver who misses a turn. They do not stop the car and abandon the trip. They adjust and keep moving. Fluent speakers treat conversations in much the same way. A forgotten word is not proof of failure. It is just a small detour. And once you start seeing it that way, hesitation becomes much less intimidating. You stop fighting every pause. You recover more quickly. And over time, you realize that fluency is not about never getting stuck. It is about knowing how to keep going when you do. There is another pattern you will start noticing once you pay attention to real conversations. The same questions keep coming back. Where are you from? What do you do? How long have you been learning English? What do you like to do in your free time? These are not rare questions. They appear so often that most people can predict them before they are asked. Yet many learners approach them as if they are brand new every single time. They stop and think, search for words, rearrange the sentence, check the grammar, and spend valuable mental energy solving a problem that is not really a problem anymore. Fluent speakers usually take a different approach. They have familiar answers ready, not memorized speeches, not rehearsed monologues, just responses they have used enough times that they come naturally. When someone asks where they are from, they do not need to build the answer from scratch. The answer is already close to the surface. And that speed matters more than most learners realize. Because every bit of attention you save on predictable questions becomes available for the unpredictable parts of the conversation. The follow-up question, the unexpected comment, the new topic that nobody saw coming. That is where conversations become interesting. Think about tying your shoes. At some point, the process became automatic, not because you memorized instructions, but because repetition removed the need to think about every step. Speaking develops in much the same way. The more often you use certain responses, the less effort they require. And that is not cheating, it is efficiency. In fact, fluent speakers rely on familiar language far more often than most people realize. Because fluency is not about creating every sentence from nothing, it is about saving your mental energy for the moments that actually require creativity. And when common responses become automatic, you finally have more attention available for the part of speaking that matters most, responding naturally to whatever comes next. Most people think better speaking requires longer study sessions, so they create an ambitious plan. An hour every day, maybe even 90 minutes on weekends. For a few days, it feels realistic. Then real life shows up. Work gets busy. A meeting runs late. Family responsibilities demand attention. The day disappears faster than expected. And suddenly, that carefully planned study session never happens. This is where many learners get trapped. They spend so much time waiting for the perfect practice window that they overlook the opportunities already sitting inside their day. Interestingly, many fluent speakers do not spend every spare minute studying English. What they often do instead is much simpler. They attach English to activities they are already doing. While making breakfast, they describe what they are cooking. While walking, they summarize a video they watched earlier. During a commute, they talk through tomorrow's plans or replay a recent conversation in English. None of these moments seem impressive on their own. 3 minutes here, 5 minutes there, a few sentences while doing something else. It feels too small to matter. But those small moments add up faster than most people realize, because every time you describe, explain, summarize, or retell something from memory, you are practicing the exact skills speaking depends on. You are training yourself to pull language out when you need it. That is much closer to real conversation than simply recognizing words in a book or on a screen. Think about it like exercise. A person who walks every day often makes more progress than someone who waits for the perfect time to start an intense workout routine. Consistency wins, and fluency works the same way. It is not built through occasional bursts of motivation. It is built through hundreds of small moments of retrieval woven into everyday life. And when that becomes a habit, speaking starts feeling less like practice and more like something your mind naturally does. Many learners imagine fluency as a dramatic breakthrough, a moment where everything suddenly clicks. One day they are freezing in conversations. The next day, English flows effortlessly. It is a comforting idea. The problem is that fluency rarely works that way. For most people, the change is much quieter. So quiet, in fact, that they often do not notice it happening. At first, the pauses become a little shorter. Questions that once left you staring into space for 10 seconds now take 5. Then something else changes. You notice yourself translating less often, not because you made a conscious decision to stop, but because certain responses begin appearing on their own. A few weeks later, another shift happens. You forget a word, but instead of freezing, you find another way to explain the idea. You make a mistake, but the conversation keeps moving. What once felt like a disaster now feels like a small bump in the road. And that is a much bigger sign of progress than most learners realize. Because fluency is not the absence of mistakes, it is the ability to keep communicating despite them. As this process continues, speaking starts to feel different, lighter, less exhausting, less like a test you need to pass, less like a performance where every sentence is being judged. It starts feeling more like what conversations were always meant to be, two people exchanging ideas. Then one day, usually when you least expect it, you notice something unusual. Someone asks you a question. You answer. The conversation continues. And afterward, you realize you were not thinking much about your English at all. You were focused on the topic, the story, the person in front of you. That is the turning point so many learners spend years chasing, because the goal was never to make English disappear from your mind. The goal was to stop making English the center of your attention. And when that happens, you are no longer focused on producing language. You are focused on using language to connect, respond, and communicate naturally. So let us return to the question we started with. Why does your mind seem to go blank at the exact moment you need English the most? After everything we have covered, the answer is probably very different from what many learners expect. In most cases, freezing is not proof that your English is weak. It is a sign that too many things are happening at once. Within a few seconds, you are trying to find the right words, organize them into a sentence, check the grammar, monitor your pronunciation, avoid mistakes, translate ideas, and handle the pressure of another person waiting for an answer. That is a lot for anyone to manage. And when too many tasks compete for attention at the same time, speed is usually the first thing to disappear. That is why fluent speakers often look more relaxed, even when they do not know every word or use perfect grammar. They are not necessarily thinking faster. They have simply reduced the amount of work they ask themselves to do during a conversation. They rely on familiar patterns, useful phrases they have used many times before, simple sentences that communicate the message clearly, flexible strategies that help them keep talking when a word refuses to come to mind. And perhaps most importantly, they have spent more time practicing retrieval than collecting collecting information, because speaking is not about proving how much English you know, it is about using what you already know when the moment arrives. So the next time your mind goes blank, do not treat it as evidence that you have failed. Treat it as information, a reminder that the words are probably still there. They are just getting buried beneath too many competing thoughts. And once you start focusing less on perfection and more on retrieval, something begins to shift. Speaking stops feeling like a search for the perfect sentence and starts feeling like what it was always supposed to be, sharing a thought with another person before the moment passes.